Chapter 8. The Pagoda. 2 days later a prisoner was captured when endeavouring to crawl up the pagoda hill, having slipped past the outpost, and was sent into headquarters. Stanley questioned him closely, but could obtain no information whatever from him. Telling him to sit down by the house, he placed a British sentry over him. "Keep your eye," he told the sentry, "on the door of the next house. You will see a Burman coming out. You are to let him talk with the prisoner, but let no one else speak to him. Don't look as if you had any orders about him, but stand carelessly by. The fellow will tell us nothing, but it's likely enough that he will speak to one of his own countrymen." "I understand, sir." Stanley went into his house and told Meinik what he was wanted to do. "I will find out," Meinik said confidently, and a minute or two later went out and strolled along past the prisoner. As he did so, he gave him a little nod, and returning again shortly, saluted him in Burmese. The third time he passed, he looked inquiringly at the sentry, as if to ask whether he might speak to the prisoner. The soldier, however, appeared to pay no attention to him, but stood with grounded musket, leaning against the wall, and Meinik went up to the man. "You are in bad luck," he said. "How did you manage to fall into the hands of these people?" "It matters not to you," the Burman said indignantly, "since you have gone over to them." "Not at all, not at all," Meinik replied. "Do you not know that there are many here who, like myself, have come in as fugitives, with instructions what to do when our people attack? I am expecting news as to when the soothsayers declare the day to be a fortunate one. Then we shall all be in readiness to do our share, as soon as the firing begins." "It will be on the 4th day from this," the Burman said. "We do not know whether it will be the night before or the night after. The soothsayers say both will be fortunate nights, and the invulnerables will then assault the pagoda, and sweep the barbarians away. The princes and Woongees will celebrate the great annual festival there, 2 days later." "That is good," Meinik said. "We shall be on the lookout, never fear." "What are they going to do to me? Will they cut off my head?" "No, you need not be afraid of that. These white men never kill prisoners. After they are once taken, they are safe. You will be kept for a time, and when our countrymen have destroyed the barbarians and taken the town, they will free you from prison. There are some of the white officers coming. I must get away, or they will be asking questions." As he walked away, the sentry put his musket to his soldier and began to march briskly up and down. A moment later, the general stepped up to him. "What are you doing, my man? Who put you on guard over that prisoner?" "I don't know his name, sir," the sentry said, standing at attention. "He was a young staff officer. I came to the guard tent and called for a sentry, and as I was next on duty, the sergeant sent me with him. He put me to watch this man." "All right. Keep a sharp lookout over him." "I wonder what Brooke left the fellow here for, instead of sending him to prison," the general said to Colonel Adair. "We examined him, but could get nothing out of him, even when I threatened to hang him." "Well, I'll just run up to headquarters and ask him, sir." Just as he entered the house, Stanley was coming down the stairs. "The general wants to know, Mr. Brooke, why you placed a prisoner under a guard by his house, instead of sending him to the prison, as usual." "I was just coming to tell him, sir." "Oh, well, he's outside, so you can tell us both together." "Well, Mr. Brooke, what made you put a sentry over the man and leave him here? The men are hard enough worked without having unnecessary sentry duty." "Yes, sir. I only left him for a few minutes. I was convinced the man knew something, by his demeanour when I questioned him, and I thought I might as well try if my man could not get more out of him than I could. So I put a sentry over him, and gave him instructions that he was to let a Burman, who would come out of this house, speak to the prisoner, but that no one else was to approach him. Then I instructed my man as to the part that he was to play. He passed 2 or 3 times, making a sign of friendship to the prisoner. Then, as the sentry had apparently no objection to his speaking to him, he came up. At first the man would say nothing to him, but Meinik told him that he was one of those who had been sent to Rangoon to aid when the assault took place, and that he was anxiously waiting for news when the favourable day would be declared by the astrologers, so that he and those with him would be ready to begin their work, as soon as the attack commenced. The prisoner fell into the snare, and told him that it would be made either on the night before or on the night of the 4th day from this, when the invulnerables had undertaken to storm the pagoda. It seems that the date was fixed partly because it was a fortunate one, and also in order that the princes and the head officials might properly celebrate the great annual festival of the pagoda, which falls, it seems, on the 6th day from now. "Oh, excellent indeed, Mr. Brooke. It's a great relief for me to know when the assault is going to take place, and from what point it will be delivered. But what made you think of the story that the Burman was one of a party that had come in to do something?" "It was what Colonel Adair mentioned at dinner last evening, sir. He was saying how awkward it would be if some of these natives who have come in were to fire the town, just as a strong attack was going on and most of the troops engaged with the enemy. It was not unlikely that, if such a plan had been formed, the prisoner would know of it, and that he might very well believe that my man said that some men had been sent into the town with that or some similar intention." "True enough. The idea was a capital one, Mr. Brooke, and we shall be ready for them whichever night they come. Will you please go across to the guard tent and tell the sergeant to send a corporal across to the man on sentry, with orders to take the prisoner to jail and hand him over to the officer in command there. When you have done that, will you ride out to the pagoda and inform your colonel what you have discovered? It will be a relief to him and to the men, for as the date of the attack has been uncertain, he has been obliged to largely increase his patrols, and to keep a portion of his force all night under arms. He will be able to decrease the number and let the men have some sleep as they can for the next 2 nights. The clouds are banking up, but I am very much afraid that the rain is going to set in again. They say that we shall have another 2 months of it." After seeing the prisoner marched away, Stanley rode to the pagoda, and saying that he had come with a message from the general, was at once shown into the colonel's quarters. "Any news, Mr. Brooke?" "Yes, Colonel. The general has requested me to inform you at once of the news that I have obtained from a prisoner, namely, that either on the night of the 30th or the 31st your position will be attacked by the men who are called the Invulnerables." "Well, we will give them a chance to prove whether their title is justified," the colonel said, cheerfully. "That's very good news. The men are getting thoroughly worn out with the extra night duty caused by this uncertainty. You think that there is no doubt that the news is correct?" "None whatever, sir. I could do nothing with the prisoner, but Buy Merman pretended to have a mission here, to kick up a row in the town when the attack began, and the man, believing his story, at once told him that the attack will be made on the pagoda by the Invulnerables on the early morning of the 4th day from this, or on the next night, the astrologers having declared that the time would be propitious, and also because they were very anxious to have the pagoda in their hands, in order that the princes and the Wongees might celebrate the great annual festival that is held, it seems, 2 days later." The colonel laughed. "I am afraid that they will have to put it off for another year. The general gave no special orders, I suppose?" "No, sir. He had only just received the news, and ordered me to ride over at once to you, as he was sure that you would be glad to know that it would not be necessary to keep so many men on night duty for the next 2 days." "Thank you, Mr. Brooke. Will you kindly tell the general that I am very pleased at the news? No doubt he will be up here himself this afternoon or tomorrow." Stanley rode back fast, and was just in time to escape a tremendous downpour of rain, which began a few minutes after he returned. He went in at once to the general's, but was told that he was engaged with the quartermaster and adjutant generals. He therefore went into the anteroom, where Tollemache, his fellow aide-de-camp, was standing at the window looking out at the rain. "This is a beastly climate," he grumbled. "It's awful to think that we are likely to get another 2 months of it, and shall then have to wait at least another before the country is dry enough to make a move. You were lucky getting in just now, before it began." "I was indeed," Stanley agreed, "for I had ridden off without my cloak, and should have been drenched had it begun 2 minutes earlier. I saw you gallop past, and wondered what you were in such a hurry about. Was it like this when you were out in the woods?" "Oh, no, not in the least. There is very little rain near Ava, though the country is a good deal flooded where it is flat, from the rivers being swollen by the rains in the hills. We had lovely weather all the time." "I should like to see a little lovely weather here. The last week's been almost worse than the rain. The steamy heat's like being in a vapour bath. If it were not that I am on duty, I should like to strip and go out and enjoy a shower bath for half an hour." Stanley laughed. "It really would be pleasant," he said. "I don't think that I gained much by hurrying back, for the gallop has thrown me into such a perspiration that I might almost as well be drenched by the rain, except that my clothes won't suffer so much." "Ah, it's all very well for you," the other grumbled. "Of course, after once having wandered about in the forest, painted up like a nigger, you feel cheerful under almost any circumstances. But for us who have been cooped up, doing nothing in this beastly place, it's impossible to look at things cheerfully." "Have you heard that the enemy are going to attack on Tuesday or Wednesday night?" "No!" the other exclaimed with a sudden animation. "The general only came in a quarter of an hour ago, and as he had the 2 bigwigs with him, of course I did not speak to him. Is it certain? How did you hear that?" "Oh, it's quite certain. That is, unless the Burmese change their mind, which is not likely. The princes and the Wongees want to celebrate the great annual festival at the pagoda on Friday, and so the Invulnerables are going, as they think, to capture it either on Tuesday or Wednesday night. I have just been up there to tell the colonel. As to your other question, how did I learn it? Well, I got it, or rather my Burman did, from that prisoner we were questioning this morning. He would not say anything then, but my man got round him, and believing that he was a spy or something of that kind, the prisoner told him all about it." "Are they only going to attack at the pagoda?" "That I cannot say. That is the only point that the man mentioned. I should say that it would only be there." "Why should it only be there?" "Because I should imagine that even the Burmese must be beginning to doubt whether they could defeat our whole force, and as they particularly wish to occupy the pagoda on Friday, they would hardly risk an attack on other points which might end in disaster, while what with the propitious nature of the day, and the fact that the Invulnerables have undertaken to capture the pagoda, no doubt they look upon that as certain." "Yes, I suppose you are right, Brooke. Well, I do hope that the general will let us go up to see the fun." "What, even if it's raining?" "Of course," the other said indignantly. "What does one care for rain when there's something to do? Why, I believe that if it was coming down in a sheet, and the men had to wade through the swamps waist deep, they'd all march in the highest spirits, if there was the chance of a fight with the Burmans at the end of the day. However, I'm afraid that there is no chance of our getting off, unless the chief goes himself. There may be attacks in other places. As you say, it's not likely, but it is possible. Therefore, of course, we should have to be at hand to carry orders. Of course, if he takes his post at the pagoda, it will be all right, though the betting is that we shall have to gallop off just at the most interesting moment." Presently the two officers left the general. The latter's bell rang, and Stanley went in. "You saw the colonel, Mr. Brooke?" "Yes, sir, and he begged me to say that he was extremely glad to get the news, and much obliged to you for sending it so promptly. There is no occasion for you and Mr. Tollemache to stay here any longer now, but at 5 o'clock I shall ride out to the pagoda. At any rate, should I want you before then, I shall certainly know where to send for you." This was the general order, for in the afternoon there was, when things were quiet, a hush for 2 or 3 hours. The work of the aides de camp was, indeed, generally very light, for as there were no movements of troops, no useless parades, and very few military orders to be carried, they had a great deal of time on their hands, and usually took it by turns to be on duty for the day, the one off duty being free to pay visits to acquaintances in the various camps, or on board ship. During the rainy season, however, very few officers or men went beyond shelter, unless obliged to do so, and from 2 till 4 or 5, no small proportion passed the time in sleep. Stanley had intended to pay a visit to the Larne, as Captain Marryat, who had dined at the staff mess on the previous evening, had invited him to go on board, whenever it might be convenient to him. The Larne had performed good service in the operations against the stockades, and her boats had been particularly active and successful. Her captain was one of the most popular, as well as one of the most energetic officers in the service, and was to become as popular with future generations as the brightest of all writers of sea stories. However, the day was not favourable for any excursion on the water. Stanley therefore went back to his room, where, divesting himself of his jacket, he sat down at the open window and read up a batch of the latest newspapers from England that had been lent him by Colonel Adair. At 5 o'clock Meinik came in to say that his horse was at the general's door. Stanley hastily put on his jacket and cloak and sallied out. The general came down in a few minutes, following by Tollemache, and, mounting, they rode to the pagoda. Here Sir Archibald had a talk with the colonel of the 89th, and the officer commanding the battery of the Madras artillery. Both were of opinion that their force was amply sufficient to resist any attack. The only approach to it from the forest was a long road between 2 swamps, which, a short distance away, had become lakes since the wet weather set in. "Had they taken us by surprise," the colonel said, "some of them might have got across before we were quite ready for them, and might have given us some trouble, but as we shall be prepared, I don't think that any of them will reach the foot of this hill, and if they do, none of them would reach this terrace. If an attack were made from the other side, it would of course be a good deal more serious, as the ground is firm, and they could attack all along the foot of the hill. But as they cannot get there until they have defeated the rest of the army, I consider that, even without the assistance of the guns, we could hold the hill with musket and bayonet against any force that they are likely to bring against us." "Very well, then, I shall not reinforce you, Colonel. Of course, we shall keep a considerable number of troops under arms, in case they should attack all along the line, at the same time that they make their principal effort here. I rather hope that the rain will keep on until this affair is over." The colonel looked surprised. "I am much more afraid," the general went on, "of fire in the town than I am of an attack without. The number of natives there is constantly increasing. No doubt the greater number of those who come in are natives of the place, who have managed, since we cleared out their war galleys from some of the creeks and channels, to escape from the authorities and to make their way in, either on foot or in fishermen's boats. But some of them may be sent in as spies, or to do us harm. I have been having a long talk over it with Colonel Adair this afternoon, and he quite agrees with me that we must reckon on the probability of an attempt to fire the town. It would be a terrible blow to us if they succeeded, for the loss of our stores would completely cripple us. They would naturally choose the occasion of an attack upon our lines for the attempt, for in this place Most of the troops will be under arms and drawn up outside the town; and in the second place, the sight of the place on fire would cause much confusion, would inspire our assailants, and necessitate a considerable force being withdrawn from the field to fight the fire. If the rains continue, we need feel no uneasiness whatever, though, for there would be no getting anything to burn; whereas in dry weather a man with a torch might light the thatch as fast as he could run along, and a whole street would be in a blaze in 2 or 3 minutes, and if a wind happened to be blowing, it might make a sweep of the whole place, in spite of all our efforts." "Yes, I see that, sir. I own that I never gave it a thought before." "I shall come up here, Colonel, unless we obtain sure news before the time arrives that the attack is going to be a general one. Indeed, it is in any case the best place to post myself, for I can see over the whole country and send orders to any point where the enemy may be making progress, or where our men can advance with advantage. The line of fire flashes will be as good a guide at night as the smoke by day." "I will get a cot rigged up for you, General, as we don't know which night it is to be." "Thank you. Yes, I may just as well turn in, all standing, as the sailors say, and get a few hours' sleep, for in this climate one cannot keep at it day and night, as we had to do in Spain." The 2 aides-de-camp were kept in suspense as to what the general's intentions were, and it was not until the morning of Tuesday that he said to them: "I am going up to the pagoda this evening, Mr. Tollemache, and you had better, therefore, put some provisions and a bottle of brandy into your holsters." At 9 in the evening they rode off. The rain had ceased, the moon was shining through the clouds. "It will be down by midnight," Tollemache said. "I should think most likely they will wait for that. They will think that we shall not be able to take aim at them in the darkness, and that they will manage to get to the foot of the hill without loss." When they reached the platform in front of the pagoda, their syces took their horses. Meinik had begged Stanley to let him take his groom's place on this occasion, and laying aside the dress he ordinarily wore, he assumed the light attire of an Indian syce, and had run behind the horses with the others. He had a strong desire to see the fighting, but his principal motive in asking to be allowed to accompany Stanley was that, although greatly impressed with what he had seen of the drill and discipline of the white and native regiments, he could not shake off his faith in the Invulnerables, and had a conviction that the pagoda would be captured, and therefore wished to be at hand to bring up Stanley's horse at the critical moment, and to aid him to escape from the assailants. Fires were burning as usual at several points on the terrace. 2 companies were under arms, and were standing well back from the edge of the platform, so as to be out of sight of those in the forest. The rest of the men were sitting round the fires. Their muskets were piled in lines hard by. When he alighted, the general proceeded to the battery. "Have you everything in readiness, Major?" he asked the officer in command. "Yes, sir. The guns are all loaded with grape, and as it will be very dark when the moon has set, I have pegged a white tape along just under each gun, so that they can be trained upon the causeway, however dark it may be." "That is a very good idea," the general said. "There is nothing more difficult than laying guns accurately in the dark." The colonel now arrived, a soldier having brought the news to him as soon as the general reached the platform. "I see that you are well prepared to give them a hot reception, Colonel." "I certainly hope so, sir. I have a strong patrol out beyond the causeway. My orders are that they are to resist strongly for a minute or two, so as to give us time to have the whole of our force in readiness here. Then they are to retreat at the double to the foot of the hill, and then to open fire again, so that we may know that they are out of the way, and that we can begin when we like. We have been making some port fires this afternoon, and I have a dozen men halfway down the hill, and directly the outposts are safely across, they are to light the port fires, which will enable us to take aim. These white tapes will be guide enough for the artillery, but my men would make very poor shooting if they could not make out the muzzles of their guns. Anyhow, I don't think that it is likely that the enemy will get across the causeway, however numerous they may be." "Oh, I don't think they will, Colonel. Certainly, so far, they have shown themselves contemptible in attack, and have never made a successful stand, even for a minute, when we once entered their stockades; though they defend them pluckily enough, until we have once got a footing inside. Still, these fellows ought to fight well tonight, for if they are beaten, it will be a death blow to their reputation among their countrymen. Besides, many of them do believe in the power they claim, and, as we have found before now in India, fanatics are always formidable." After taking a look round at the colonel, the general accompanied him to his quarters, while the 2 aides-de-camp remained on the terrace chatting with the officers, and then, after a time, went with some of them to the mess tent, where they sat smoking and talking until midnight, when all went out. The troops were formed up under arms, and all listened impatiently for something that would show that the long delayed assault would take place that night. At 12:30 there was the sound of a shot, which sent an electrical thrill through the troops. It was followed almost immediately by others. The troops were at once marched forward to the edge of the platform. A babel of wild shouts went up at the sound of the first shots, followed by a burst of firing. The two aides de camp had taken their places close to the general, who was standing in the gap between the infantry and the guns, and was looking intently through his night glasses at the forest. "They are in a dense mass," he said. "I cannot see whether they are in any regular order, but they are certainly packed a great deal closer than I have ever before seen them. Those in front have got lanterns. They are coming along fast." As yet the enemy were half a mile away, but the lanterns and the flash of their guns showed their exact position, while the fire of the outposts was kept up steadily. As the latter fell back along the causeway, the interval between the two forces decreased, and then the fire of the outposts ceased, as, in accordance with their orders, they broke into the double. The uproar of the advancing crowd was prodigious. Every man was yelling at the top of his voice imprecations upon the defenders of the pagoda, who were standing in absolute silence, waiting eagerly for the word of command. Suddenly the firing broke out again at the foot of the hill, and immediately a bright light shot up from its face. The edge of the dense mass of Burmese was now but some 50 yards from the wall that surrounded the foot of the hill, and the causeway behind was occupied by a solid mass of men. Then came the sharp order to the artillerymen, and gun after gun poured its charge of grape shot into the crowd, while at the same moment the infantry began to fire, by companies, in steady volleys. For an instant the din of the assailants was silenced. Then their shouts rose again, and after a moment's hesitation they continued their advance. But not for long. None but the most disciplined soldiers could have advanced under that storm of grape and bullets, and in 10 minutes they fled in wild confusion, leaving the causeway thickly covered with the dead. Again and again the British cheers rose, loud and triumphant. Then the infantry were told to fall out, but the guns continued their fire until the fugitives were well into the forest. Between the shots the general listened attentively, and examined the country towards the town through his glasses. "Everything is quiet," he said. "It is probable that if those fellows had carried the hill, they would have made a signal, and there might have been a general attack. As it is, the affair is over for the night, and the Invulnerables will have some difficulty in accounting for their failure and loss. Now, gentlemen, we may as well have up the horses and ride back. We hardly expected to get away as soon as this." "Well, Meinik, what do you think of your Invulnerables now?" Stanley said, as the Burman, after picketing his horse, came up to his room to see if he wanted anything before lying down on his bed in the passage. "I don't know," the Burman replied gravely. "They may be holy men, and proof, perhaps, against native weapons, but they are no good against your cannon and muskets. I understand, now, how it is that you beat us so easily. Your men all stood quiet and in order. One only heard the voices of the officers, and the crash as they fired together. Then your guns are terrible. I have seen ours firing, but though our pieces are smaller than yours, your men fire 5 shots to our 1. I stood by while they were loading. It was wonderful. Nobody talked, and nobody gave orders. Each man knew what he had to do. One did something, and directly another did something, and almost before the smoke of the last shot was out of the gun, it was ready to be fired again. It is clear to me that we have not learned how to fight, and that your way of having only a few men, well taught, and knowing exactly what they have to do, is better than ours of having great numbers, and letting everyone fight as he pleases. It is bad, every way. The brave men get to the front and are killed, and then the others run away. You were right. We shall never turn you out of Rangoon till Bandoola comes. He has all our best troops with him, and he has never been beaten. All the troops know him, and will fight for him, as they will not fight for these princes, who know nothing of war, and are chosen only because they are the king's brothers. When he comes, you will see." "No doubt we shall, Meinik. And you will see that, although they may make a better fight of it than they have done tonight, it will be just the same in the end." For the next 2 months the time passed slowly. No attacks were made by the enemy after the defeat of the assault upon the pagoda. Peasants and deserters who came reported that there was profound depression among the Burmese troops. Great numbers had left the colours, and there was no talk of another attack. The troops being, therefore, relieved of much of their arduous night duty, the English took the offensive. The stockades on the Dalla River, and those upon the Panlang branch, the principal passage into the main stream of the Irrawaddy, were attacked and carried, the enemy suffering heavily, and many pieces of artillery being captured. The rains continued almost unceasingly, and the troops suffered terribly in health. Scarce 3,000 remained fit for duty, and the greater portion of these were so emaciated and exhausted, by the effects of the climate, that they were altogether unfit for active operations. 3 weeks after the fight at the pagoda, a vessel came up the river, with a letter from the officer in charge of the troops assembled to bar the advance of Bandoola against Chittagong, saying that the Burmese army had mysteriously disappeared. It had gone off at night so quietly and silently that our outposts, which were but a short distance from it, heard no sign of movement whatever. The Burmese had taken with them their sick, tents, and stores, and nothing but a large quantity of grain had been found in their deserted stockades. The news was received with satisfaction by the troops. There was little doubt that the court of Ava, finding that their generals had all failed in making the slightest impression upon our lines, and had lost vast numbers of men, had at last turned to the leader who had conquered province after province for it, and had sent him orders to march with his whole army to bring the struggle to a close. The soldiers rejoiced at the thought that they were at last to meet a real Burmese army. Hitherto they had generally stood on the defensive, and had to fight the climate rather than the foe, and it seemed to them that the campaign was likely to be interminable. The march of the Burmese from Ramoo to Sembeughewn, the nearest point of the river to the former town, must have been a terrible one. The distance was over 200 miles, the rains were ceaseless, and the country covered with jungles and marshes, and intersected by rivers. No other army could have accomplished such a feat. The Burmans, however, accustomed to the unhealthy climate, lightly clad, and carrying no weight save their arms and 16 days' supply of rice, passed rapidly over it. Every man was accustomed to the use of an axe and to the formation of rafts, and in an incredibly short time rivers were crossed, deep swamps traversed on roads made by closely packed faggots, and but a few days after hearing that Bandoola had started, the general learned from peasants that the news had come down that he and a portion of his army had arrived at Sembeughewn. Almost at the same time, other parties who travelled down along the coast reached Donabew, a town on the Irrawaddy, some 40 miles in direct line from Rangoon. This had been named as the rendezvous of the new army, and to this a considerable portion of Bandoola's force made their way direct from Ramoo, it being the custom of the Burmese to move, when on a march through a country where no opposition was to be looked for, in separate detachments, each under its own leader, choosing its own way, and making for a general rendezvous. Travelling in this manner, they performed the journey far more rapidly than they could have done moving in one body, and could better find shelter and food. Other forces from Prome, Tanu, and other quarters were known to be marching towards Donabew. It was soon reported that the dejected forces around Rangoon had gained courage and confidence at the news that Bandoola and his army were coming to their aid, and that the deserters were returning in large numbers from their villages. The British sick were sent away in the shipping to Mergui and Tavoy, 2 coast towns of which we had taken possession, and both of which were healthily situated. The change had a marvellous effect, and the men who would have speedily succumbed to the poisonous exhalations of the swamp round Rangoon rapidly regained their strength in their new quarters. Chapter 9: Victories. In the meantime, negotiations had been going on with Siam, between which state and Burma there was the bitterest enmity. It had been thought that Siam would have willingly grasped the opportunity to revenge itself for the many losses of territory that it had suffered at the hands of Burma. This there was no doubt that it would have been glad to do, but our occupation of several points on the coast of Tenasserim roused the fears of Siam, and inclined it to the belief that we might prove an even more dangerous neighbour than Burma. The court of Ava had, on its part, also sent urgent messages to the king of Siam, when misfortunes had to some extent lowered its pride, calling upon him to make common cause with Burma, and to join it in repelling an enemy who would doubtless be as dangerous to him as to Burma. Siam, however, determined to steer a middle course. An army was assembled in readiness for any contingency, but Siam believed as little as Burma itself that the British could possibly be victorious over that power, and feared its vengeance if she were to ally herself with us, while, upon the other hand, Siam had a long sea coast, and feared the injury our fleet might inflict upon it were it to join Burma. The king, therefore, gave both powers an assurance of his friendship, and marched his army down to the frontier of the province of Martaban, which bordered on the great Salween River on the Tenasserim coast, and lay some 200 miles from Rangoon, across the Gulf of Martaban. The intentions of the king being so doubtful, the advance of the Siamese army in this direction could not be regarded with indifference by the British. The town of Martaban was the centre of the Burmese military power in Tenasserim, and the advance towards it of the Siamese army would place it in direct communication with that of Burma. On the 13th of October, therefore, a force consisting of a wing of the 41st Regiment and the 3rd Madras Infantry sailed from Rangoon against the town. The expedition was delayed by light winds, and when it arrived at the mouth of the river found that every preparation had been made for an obstinate defence. They learned from a peasant that strong works had been erected on every eminence round the town, and that the road from the coast had been cut and stockaded. Approach by this route was impossible, for there were 20 miles of country to be traversed, and much of this was under water from the inundations. It was therefore determined to go up the river, although this was so shallow and full of shoals that the navigation was extremely difficult. At last, after great labour, incurred by the ships constantly getting ashore, they succeeded in making their way up to Martaban, and anchored off the town. A heavy cannonade was carried on for some time between the ships and the enemy's works. Then the troops were embarked in boats, which rowed for the shore under a very heavy fire from the enemy. As soon as they landed and advanced to attack the stockades, the Burmese lost heart and hastily retreated, while the inhabitants received the troops as they entered with the warmest welcome, for they were, for the most part, natives of Pegu, and still entertained a deep hatred for the Burmese, because of the long oppression that they had suffered at their hands. Throughout the rest of Tenasserim, however, and indeed throughout the whole country traversed by the troops later on, the inhabitants appear to have entirely forgotten their ancient nationality, and the conquest of their country by the Burmans, and to have become completely absorbed by them. Throughout the whole time that we occupied Martaban, the people gave no trouble whatever, and indeed offered to raise a force for service with us, if we wished it. At the end of October the rain ceased, to the intense delight of the troops, and the cold season set in. November was, however, an exceptionally deadly month, the occasional days of fine weather drawing up the exhalations from the swamps, and the number of deaths was greater than they had been at any previous time. There was, too, no prospect of a forward movement at present. The expedition had come unprovided with boats or other means of transport, making sure that an abundant supply would be obtained in a country where the whole trade was carried on by the rivers. The promptness with which the native authorities had, on the first appearance of the fleet, sent every boat away, had disappointed this anticipation, and although the opening of some of the other rivers had enabled the local fishermen to bring their boats to Rangoon, where fish were eagerly purchased, the British troops were still, up to the end of November, without the means of sending 100 men up the river, save in the boats of the fleet. The Indian authorities, believing that when the Burmese found themselves impotent to turn us out of Rangoon, the court of Ava would be glad to negotiate, had not, until the autumn was drawing to a close, thought of making any preparations to supply the army with water carriage. They now, however, began to bestir themselves. 500 boatmen were sent from Chittagong, bringing many boats down with them, and building others at Rangoon. Transports with draft cattle sailed from Bengal, and a considerable reinforcement of troops was on its way to join at the end of December, for all the natives agreed that no movement could be made by land until the end of January. In November, even Bandula's army was obliged to make its approach by water. Early in that month it was learned that the Burmese general had given orders for the advance, and preparations were at once begun to meet what none doubted would be a very serious attack. The reinforcements had not yet arrived, and the greatly diminished force was far too small for the length of the line that had to be defended. Redoubts were therefore thrown up, pagodas and other buildings were fortified, and 2 complete lines of works constructed, from the great pagoda to the city, one facing east and the other west. The post at Kemmendine was strengthened, and was supported by Her Majesty's sloop Sophie, a company's cruiser, and a strong division of gunboats. The retention of this post was of great importance, as it barred the river approach to Rangoon, and prevented the enemy sending down a huge fleet of war galleys and fire rafts to attack the town, and set fire to the merchant shipping lying off it. In the last week of November, smoke was seen to rise from many points in the forest. Many fugitives came in from their villages and reported that Bandula's army were all on their way down the river, and by the end of the month some 60,000 men, with a large train of artillery and a body of cavalry, were assembled round our position. Of this force, 30,000 were armed with muskets. They had with them, too, a great number of jingols. These little guns carried ball of from 6 to 12 ounces, and were mounted on a light carriage, which 2 men could wheel with ease. The cannon were carried to the scene of action on elephants. The cavalry were 700 strong, drawn from the borders of Manipur. The rest of the army were armed with swords and spears, and carried implements for stockading and entrenching. The force was accompanied by a number of astrologers, and by the Invulnerables, who had doubtless satisfactorily explained their failure to capture the pagoda. A great semicircle of light smoke, rising from the trees, showed that the position taken up by Bandoola extended from the river above Kemmendine to the neighbourhood of Rangoon. On the night of the 31st, the troops at the pagoda heard a loud and continuous stir in the forest. It gradually approached, and by morning great masses of troops had gathered at the edge of the jungle, within musket shot of the post. The garrison there were drawn up in readiness to repel a sudden rush, but just as the sun rose, a din made by thousands of men engaged in cutting down the trees began, and it was evident that the Burmese were going to adopt their usual plan of entrenching themselves behind stockades. During the time that had elapsed between the repulse of the Invulnerables and the arrival of Bandoola's army, Stanley's work was light, and the life dull and monotonous. An hour was spent every morning in examining the fugitives who had, by the retreat of the Burmese, been enabled to make their way back to the town, and of the women who had escaped from the vigilance of the Burmese police, and had come in from the villages where they had been held as hostages for their husbands. Once or twice a week he went off with the general to the hospital ship, to inquire into the state of the sick, and to pay a visit to the long line of cots along the main and lower deck. Almost every day he rode, in spite of the weather, to one or another of the regimental camps, and soon came to know most of the officers of the force. His previous experience on the rivers had done much to acclimatize him, and his health continued good. On the evening of the 30th he had, at the general's order, ridden up to the pagoda. It was considered likely that the attack would be delivered there in the first place, and at 3 o'clock in the morning, when it became evident that a large body of men were approaching through the forest, he galloped back to Rangoon with the news, and at 5 rode out again with Sir Alexander Campbell. Among the garrison there was much disappointment when the sound of wood chopping announced that the Burmese did not intend to attack, but the general, who had been watching the edge of the jungle through his glasses, lowered them and put them in their case with an expression of satisfaction. "I don't want them to attack, Colonel," he said. "If they do, and we beat them off, we are no nearer the end than before. That sort of thing might be carried on for months, as long, in fact, as there remains a man to bring up. What we want is to inflict such a heavy blow upon them that even the court of Ava may become convinced that they cannot hope to drive us out of Rangoon, in which case they may consent to negotiate, and we may bring the war to an end. Heaven knows that we have suffered enough loss at present, and I don't want to have to undertake such a difficult operation as an advance against Ava. I am glad to see that they have begun to construct stockades. I do not intend to interfere until they have completely finished their work, and gained sufficient confidence to make a general attack on us. Then we shall be able to give them a heavy lesson. Ah, there they are, at work." As he spoke, a roar of musketry and artillery broke out suddenly from Kemmendine, and all eyes were turned in that direction. The spot was 2 miles distant, but the forest shut out, alike, the view of the river and of the works held by us. The exact position, however, was indicated by the masts of the 2 war vessels rising above the trees. Soon great wreaths of heavy white smoke rose above the forest in and around Kemmendine, shutting out all view. The fire continued without abatement, and it was evident that the attack was a hot and determined one. Confident as all felt that the little fort would be able to defend itself successfully, the great smoke clouds were watched with some feeling of anxiety, for the garrison was, after all, but a handful. In momentary intervals of the firing, the yells and shouts of the natives could be distinctly heard, and once or twice, after a heavy broadside from the ships of war, the cheers of the British sailors could be plainly recognized. After 2 hours' fighting, the din gradually ceased. The clouds of smoke rolled away, and the masts of the ship became visible, and the garrison of the pagoda raised 3 hearty cheers, to tell the defenders that their successful defence had been watched and welcomed. Presently some heavy columns of the enemy issued from the forest on the other side of the river, and marched across the plain to Dalla, which faced Rangoon. They moved with great regularity and order, led by their chiefs on horseback, their gilded umbrellas glittering in the rays of the sun. On reaching the bank of the river opposite Rangoon, they began entrenching themselves and throwing up stockades and batteries, with the evident intention of opening fire on the shipping. Soon afterwards large bodies of men issued from the forest facing the pagoda, and, marching along a slight ridge that extended from that point to the creek below Rangoon, took up their position there, and began entrenching themselves all along the line. Thus the British position was now completely surrounded. There was, however, no doubt that the main body of the enemy still faced the pagoda. "We must see what they are doing," the general said. "This is too important a point for us to allow them to erect a strongly fortified position close at hand." Accordingly, Tollemache was sent down with an order to the 18th Madras Infantry, supported by a detachment of the 13th Regiment under Major Sale, to advance against the enemy in the jungle. The movements of this force were eagerly watched from the terrace of the pagoda. At a rapid pace they crossed the intervening ground, and a rattle of musketry broke out from the jungle as they approached. The British made no response, but charged with a cheer, and were soon lost in the sight of the trees. Their regular volleys could be heard at short intervals above the scattered rattle of the Burmese musketeers, and their cheers frequently rose loud and triumphant. In half an hour the red line emerged again from the jungle, having destroyed the stockades the Burmese had erected, captured several guns, a quantity of muskets, and entrenching tools thrown away by the Burmese, and killed a large number of the enemy. During the day the enemy made repeated efforts to send fire rafts down the river from above Kemmendine. These rafts were constructed of bamboos, upon which were placed great numbers of earthenware pots filled with petroleum. These rafts were skilfully constructed and made in sections, so that when they drifted against an anchor chain they would divide, those on each side swinging round, so as to envelop the ship on both sides with fire. The sailors from the sloops and gunboats rowed up to meet the rafts, and although a heavy fire was kept up by the enemy from the jungles lining the banks, they succeeded in towing most of them safely to shore, while the rest grounded on a projecting spit off Kemmendine. So diligently did the Burmese work at all points throughout the day that by the afternoon their whole line of circumvallation was covered with earthworks, behind which they lay entirely hidden from sight. "If they could fight as well as they dig and build stockades," Sir Alexander Campbell remarked, "they would be one of the most formidable enemies in the world. No European army ever accomplished the work of entrenching themselves so speedily as they have done. Their arrangements have been admirable. Everything has been done without confusion, and each body has taken up the position allotted to it, as is evident by the fact that there is no gap in their lines. As to Bandoola's tactics, I cannot say so much for them. In the first place, he has divided his force into two parts, separated by a river, and incapable of helping each other. In the next place, great as are his numbers, his lines are far too extended. Well, we will let them go on for a time, and then show them the mistake that they have committed." Major Sale's reports of the entrenchments were that they consisted of a long line of holes, each capable of containing 2 men. The earth was dug out on one side so as to form a sort of cave. In this was a bed of straw or brushwood, on which one man could sleep while the other watched. Each hole contained a sufficient supply of rice, water, and even fuel for its inmates. One line of these holes had been completed, and another was being dug a short distance in advance. The Burmese do not relieve their men in the trenches. Those who occupy the line first made remain there. Fresh men dig and occupy the next line, and so the advance is continued until close to the work to be attacked. The system has the great advantage that a shell falling into one of these holes only kills its 2 occupants, instead of destroying many, as it might do if it fell on a continuous trench. In the afternoon the general returned to Rangoon, leaving Stanley at the pagoda, with orders to ride down should there be any change of importance. In the evening a considerable force of Burmese issued from the jungle, and prepared to entrench themselves near the northeast angle of the pagoda hill. Major Piper therefore took 2 companies of the 38th, and descending the hill drove the Burmese in confusion back to the jungle. In the morning it was found that the enemy had entrenched themselves upon some high and open ground within musket shot of the north gate of the pagoda. It was separated from the gate by a large tank, but as their jingals and musketry were able, from the point they occupied, to sweep the plateau and the huts occupied by the troops, a party of the 38th and the 28th Madras Infantry went out and drove them off. As soon, however, as our troops fell back, the Burmese reoccupied the position, and for the next few days a constant skirmishing went on at this point, while an artillery fire was maintained by the assailants and defenders along the whole line down to Rangoon, and the enemy's batteries at Dalla kept up an incessant fire on the shipping. Kemmendine was attacked time after time, and many attempts made to launch fire rafts down the river. The work was very harassing for the troops. Night and day they were expecting an attack in force, and there was a general feeling of delight when, on the evening of the 4th, orders were issued for a general movement against the enemy. The latter had by this time brought the greater portion of their guns up from the jungle and placed them in their entrenchments, and it was therefore in the power of the British to strike a heavy blow. A division of the flotilla of gunboats was ordered up the creek by the town. These opened a heavy fire upon the enemy's flank, thus attracting their attention to that point, and after the cannonade had continued for some little time, the two columns of attack, the one 800 strong under Major Sale, the other 500 strong under Major Walker of the Madras army, issued out. The latter was to attack the enemy facing the town, the former to force his way through the centre of their position. He had with him a troop of horse that had landed only the previous day. Major Walker's force was the first to encounter the enemy. Their resistance was, for a time, obstinate. Major Walker and several other officers fell in the attack on the first line of entrenchments, but the soldiers carried it at the point of the bayonet, and, as the enemy broke and retreated, followed them so hotly that the works in the rear fell into their hands with but slight opposition. Major Sale's column now began its attack on the enemy's centre. Here the resistance was more feeble, and bursting through the enemy's lines, the British drove them before them in headlong flight. Then turning, they swept along the line of entrenchments, carrying all before them until they effected a junction with the other column, which was advancing to meet them. They then drove the Burmese from every part of their works into the jungle, leaving the ground behind them covered with dead and wounded. Except at the point first attacked by Major Walker, the resistance of the Burmese was very feeble, and the British loss inconsiderable, and a large number of guns, entrenching tools, and muskets fell into the hands of the victors. The next day Bandoola rallied the troops that had been driven from the plain, and gathered the greatest part of his force in the forest round the pagoda, where they continued to push forward their works with unabated energy. The British had a day of rest given them, and on the 7th prepared to attack the enemy at this point. 4 columns of attack were formed, composed of detachments drawn from all the corps of the army. In the morning a heavy cannonade was opened upon the jungle, the artillery being assisted by several heavy guns, which had with great labour been brought up by the sailors from the ships to the pagoda. The enemy returned fire with a steady fire of light artillery, jingles, and musketry. While the firing was still going on, the 4 columns were already in motion. One had entered the jungle on the enemy's left, and another on the enemy's right. One of the central columns advanced from the foot of the pagoda hill, while the 38th Regiment descended the stairs from the north gate and advanced, one wing on each side of the tank, against the enemy's entrenchments on the high ground. As the 4 columns approached the enemy, our artillery fire ceased. The Burmese appeared for a moment bewildered at the sight of their foes advancing against them from so many directions, but they soon opened a very heavy fire upon the assailants, and kept it up with undiminished steadiness until our troops, advancing at the charge, dashed into their entrenchments and drove them headlong before them into the thick forest behind, where pursuit, which would at any time have been difficult, was now impossible, the troops, exhausted by their 7 days and nights' watching, being wholly incapable of following their active and lightly armed enemies. There now remained but the force at Dalla to cope with, and in the evening a force composed of the 89th and 43rd Madras Infantry, under Colonel Parlby, embarked in boats. The night was dark, and the troops crossed unobserved. The alarm was not given until the British actually entered the entrenchments, and opened fire upon the enemy, who were sitting, unsuspicious of danger, round their fires. Scarcely any opposition was encountered, and the whole of the works, with the guns and the stores, were soon in our hands, while the enemy were flying toward the forest. In the actions during these 3 days, the Burmese lost some 5,000 men, 240 pieces of artillery of every kind, and a great number of muskets and vast supplies of ammunition, while the British had but 50 killed and 300 wounded. Great numbers of Bandoola's men never rejoined the army, and the whole force was dispersed throughout the country. Bandoola himself was retiring toward Donabew with but a remnant of his army, when he met considerable reinforcements on their way to join him. During his operations he had left a reserve corps at the village of Kokine, 4 miles from the pagoda, and these had been busily entrenching the position which commanded the road leading from Rangoon to Donabew. The ground was elevated, and on his arrival there, Bandoola set his troops, now some 25,000 in number, to aid in the work. In a marvellously short time the heights were completely stockaded with trunks of trees, and with a broad, deep ditch in front. Beyond this were lines of felled trees, their heads pointed outward, and each branch sharpened, forming a very formidable abattis, and, believing this to be impregnable, Bandoola waited the arrival of the British. As soon as his army had been dispersed, great numbers of deserters and of the inhabitants of the village poured into Rangoon. With the deserters were mingled a good many of the troops sent in by Bandoola himself, with instructions to fire the town. In order to lull the suspicions of the British, he caused a report to be spread that Imperial Commission from the court of Ava would arrive, in the course of a few days, to treat for terms of peace. The general, however, determined to attack Bandoola before the commissioner could arrive, as it was evident that better terms could be obtained after the total dispersion of the Burmese than if their famous general remained, with 25,000 men, in a formidable position close at hand. He was uneasy at the presence of so large a number of natives in the town, and the precautions that had to be taken against fire, some time before, were now redoubled. Were one to break out, not only might the whole of the stores collected for the advance of the army be destroyed, but if Bandoola had his force gathered in readiness at the edge of the jungle, he might take advantage of the confusion that would be caused by the fire, and rush towards the attack of the town. Numbers of troops, and of sailors from the fleet, patrolled the streets in every direction at night, but in spite of their efforts, a week after the retreat of Bandoola, the dreaded cry of fire was raised. At a dozen points on the windward side of the town, fires had been lighted by incendiaries, and as there was a brisk wind blowing, the danger was extreme. The drums beat to arms along the whole of the British lines. Orders had already been issued as to what was to be done in such an emergency, and while a portion of the troops lined the trenches, the rest were marched at once to the town and formed up between it and the jungle, to repel any attack that might be made there, leaving the troops quartered in the town and the sailors of the fleet to battle with the flames. For a time it seemed as if the whole place would be swept away, but by levelling lines of huts and beating out the flames of the barriers so formed, their progress was at length checked, but not until more than half the town had been destroyed. Fortunately, this was the half farthest from the river, and with the exception of the commissariat stores for the supply of the troops of the Madras Presidency, the buildings containing the food, ammunition, and necessaries for the army escaped unharmed. What had happened once might, however, happen again, in spite of all precautions. The general therefore determined to attack Bandoola at once. Were his force once scattered, the motive for these incendiary fires would cease to operate. The difficulties were formidable. One or two light field pieces could, at the most, be taken with the column. They would have to march by a narrow and winding footpath through a thick forest, exposed at any moment to a desperate attack by the enemy. Moreover, it would be necessary to leave a strong force for the defence of Rangoon, as Bandoola would be sure to learn from his spies of the intended movement, and, having with him men intimately acquainted with every forest track, could make a rush down upon the town during the absence of so many of its defenders. The general felt it imperative, however, to attack without delay, and early on the morning of the 15th he moved out with a force of 1,500 men against Cochin. They marched without molestation through the forest, and on reaching its confines could see the truly formidable nature of the works that they were to attack. The moment they issued from the forest, a dropping fire was opened upon them by parties of the enemy, in flank and rear, and no time was lost in preparing for the assault. The 13th Light Infantry and the 18th Madras, with 60 cavalry under Brigadier General Cotton, were ordered to move round the stockade and assault it on the left rear, while the rest of the troops, some 800 strong, with 100 cavalry under the general himself, were to attack in front. The enemy's works consisted of a central entrenchment, connected with two large entrenched stockades on its flank, but somewhat advanced in front of it. As soon as the force under General Cotton had gained its position in the rear of the enemy, a gun was fired, and the whole force moved forward to the assault. The Burmans regarded the attack by so insignificant a force upon their works with much contempt, so they did not for some time fire a shot, but continued chanting a war song, swaying themselves to its cadence, stamping and beating time with their hands on their breasts. This delay proved fatal to them. When they opened fire, their assailants were already close to the ditch, and leaping down into this were sheltered from the fire of the defenders. Scaling ladders were speedily placed, and the troops, running up them, leaped down into the entrenchment. Astonished at this sudden entry into the works they had deemed impregnable, the Burmese hesitated, and the assailants, being joined by their comrades from behind, rushed impetuously upon the enemy. The column in the rear had greater difficulty, for they had several strong stockades to carry before they reached the central work, and lost 4 officers and 8 men killed, and 49 officers and men wounded, in the 13th Regiment alone. 15 minutes after the first shot was fired, the whole of the works were in our possession, and the Burmese, who gathered in a confused mass, had been decimated by our volleys. They were now in full flight, many being cut down by the cavalry before they reached the shelter of the woods. The British troops marched back to Rangoon, while the Burmese retreated to Donabew, leaving strong posts on the 2 rivers leading in that direction. Their retirement left it free to the country people to return to Rangoon, and very large numbers came in, including very many of the villagers who had been forced to fight against us. All had alike suffered from famine and hardship. Even the women had been compelled to labour in the work of stockading, and the sufferings of all had been terrible. The work of rebuilding the town began at once, and the wooden huts sprang up with great rapidity. Markets were opened, and in a short time supplies of fish, fruit, game, and vegetables poured in, sufficient not only for the native population, but to effect a most welcome change in the diet of the troops. As most of the natives were accustomed to the construction and management of boats, the work of preparing the flotilla by which the troops were to proceed up the rivers went on rapidly, and numbers of men were hired as servants and drivers for the commissariat, which the force was very insufficiently supplied, as the natives of India of that class for the most part refused, on account of their caste prejudices, to engage themselves for service across the sea. Reinforcements arrived, and Rangoon, which but 6 weeks before presented a miserable and deserted appearance, was, towards the beginning of January, a cheerful and bustling town. Preparations were being made in other quarters to assume the offensive. Some 3,000 men were driving the Burmese out of Assam, and a force 7,000 strong were marching from Sithat to expel them from Cachar and capture Manipur, while 11,000 men were assembled at Chittagong, and were advancing into Aracan with the intention of driving the Burmese from that province, and they meant, if possible, to cross the mountains and effect a junction with Sir Archibald Campbell's force. The first part of the operations were conducted with complete success, and Aracan wrested from Burma, but it was found impossible to perform the terrible journey across the mountain and swamp, or to afford any aid to the main expedition. Chapter 10: The Advance. But while the preparations for the advance were being made, the general's aides de camp had been kept at work from morning until night. There were constant communications between the military and naval authorities, for the expedition was to be a mixed one. Transports were daily arriving with troops and stores. Innumerable matters connected with the organization, both of the land and water transport, required to be arranged, and the general himself was indefatigable in superintending every detail of the work. It had been settled that the advance could not take place until the second week in February, as the roads would be impassable until that time, and the 11th of February was fixed for the commencement of operations. Upon the day after his arrival at Rangoon, Stanley had written a letter to his uncle, giving him a brief account of his adventures, and stating that he had been appointed one of the general's aides de camp. He said that he should, of course, be guided by his uncle's wishes, but now that he had entered on the campaign as an officer, he should certainly like to remain till the end, when he would at once resign his commission and rejoin his uncle. He sent this to his uncle's agent in Calcutta, but received no answer until the end of December. After expressing his delight at hearing that Stanley had not, as he had supposed, been killed at Ramoo, but was now safe and well in the British camp, he went on: "I only received your letter this morning, for I have been moving about from point to point, and, owing to the falling off of trade, had no occasion to go to Calcutta until now, and was indeed astounded at finding your letter lying for me here, as they had not forwarded it, having no idea where I was, and knowing that the chance of any letter sent on reaching me was extremely small. By all means, lad, stop where you are. Trade is improving again, for now that Bandoola's army has marched away from Ramoo, the scare among the natives has pretty well subsided. Still, I can manage very well without you, and it will certainly be a great advantage to you to serve for a year in the army, and to have been one of Campbell's aides de camp will be a feather in your cap, and will give you a good position at all the military stations. I am very glad now that I abstained from writing to your mother after the battle at Ramoo. I thought it over and over, and concluded that it was just as well to leave the matter alone for a time. Not that I had the slightest idea, or even a hope, that you were alive, but because I thought that the cessation of letters from you would, to some extent, prepare her mind for the blow when it came. It would be very improbable that she would see the Gazette, with the list of killed and wounded at Ramoo, and even if she did so, she would not associate the death of Ensign Brooke in any way with you. When we have been trading up country, there have been, once or twice, no means of sending off a letter for a couple of months, and therefore she could not have begun to feel seriously anxious about you before she received your letter from Rangoon. Everyone says that you will not be able to advance until February, so that no doubt this letter will reach you long before you leave. I hear the losses have been very heavy from fever, but I am not anxious about you on that score, for I think that you are thoroughly acclimatized. I am trying to get a contract for the supply of a couple of thousand bullocks for the use of the army, and as I know all the country so well, from Chittagong to Sylhet, and can buy below Indian prices, I think that I shall not only get the contract, but make a very good thing of it, and it may lead to other matters." After this, Stanley was hardly surprised when, in the last week of January, his uncle walked into his quarters. After the first pleasure of meeting was over, Stanley said: "I suppose you have got the contract, Uncle?" "I have, lad. I have come down from Ramgur with 6 dhows packed full. I have brought 1,000 head down, and directly I land them I am going back for the remainder, which will be ready for me by the time I get there. I have got hold of an uncommonly good fellow. He was established as a small trader at Chittagong. His business was ruined there, and he was glad to accept my offer of a berth, and he has turned out a very energetic and pushing fellow. He will come down with the next assignment. I myself am going to work my way up along the edge of the Tipperah forest, and shall pick up another 1,000 head by the time I get to Goomtee, and shall send them by water up to Sylhet, and then go up by land, picking up more on the way. I have a contract for 5,000 to be sent in, 1,000 a month, for the force that is to move against Manipur, while Johnson is to send another 2,000 down here. So you see, for the present, the store business can wait. It's a good line that I have got into. I shall make a big profit out of it, and have hopes that it will be to some extent permanent, for I can get the cattle so cheap in the interior, on the rivers we know, that I can ship them to Calcutta at lower terms than they can buy them in India, and I was as much as told that, if I carried out my present contract satisfactorily, I should get the supply of the troops there. Of course, that would not be a very great thing of itself, but as I could work it without trouble in connection with my own business, it would make a handsome addition to the profits." "But how about money, Uncle?" "Oh, that's all right, lad. I have no difficulty whatever in getting an advance at Calcutta, on the strength of my contract and upon the guarantee of my agents, so that I am all right in that respect. I asked, Uncle, because I can let you have £1,800 if you want them." Tom Pearson looked at his nephew in astonishment. "Why, what on earth have you been doing? Robbing the treasury of the King of Ava?" "No, Uncle. I had a bag of gems given me by some Burmese bandits. When I got down here, I took a few of them to a merchant. He advanced 1,500 rupees on them, and sent them to Burragee, the jeweller at Madras, and 6 weeks afterwards he paid me another 3,500. I sent up another batch, and last week I got an order from the jewellers for £1,500, so that I have more than 1,800 in hand now, and I don't think that I have sent more than a third of the gems away." "Well, that is a piece of luck, Stanley. Why on earth did the brigands give you the gems?" "Well, Uncle, there are things that, from what they told me, there is a great difficulty and risk in trying to dispose of. They are a royal monopoly, the gems, and nobody dare buy them, or if they do, will give next to nothing for them, because of the risk of the transaction, and because they know that the vendors are in a fix and must sell. Besides, there is a strong chance of their handing over anyone who offers such things to the authorities. There was one reason why they gave them to me. Then, too, they had made a good haul of merchandise, which was, to them, a great deal more valuable, as there was no difficulty in disposing of it. Lastly, they had taken a fancy to me, because I saved one of their comrades' lives, the man who showed you up here." "Well, lad, you shall tell me all about it this evening. I must be going down to the commissariat yard to arrange the landing of my beasts. I came straight to see you directly I landed. We dropped anchor here at daybreak." "I'll go with you, Uncle. I'll run in and see the chief first, and get leave off for the day. I have earned a holiday, for I have been at work pretty well morning, noon, and night for the last 2 months. You see, I have not only the duties of aide de camp, but of interpreter, and have helped both the quartermaster's department and the commissariat in making their arrangements with the natives. I dare say I shall be able to help to hurry your business on, quicker than you'd be able to get it done alone." The general at once granted Stanley leave, and he went with his uncle down to the commissariat office and introduced him to the senior officer. "We shall be glad to do all in our power to help you, Mr. Pearson," the officer said. "We have been expecting your arrival for the last week. Of course, we heard from Calcutta that you had the contract for 2,000 head. At least half of these were to be delivered by the 10th of February. We were getting rather anxious about it. The force will probably want to start before that time, and we shall have to victual both the land and water columns. Of course, I did not know that you were a relation of Mr. Brooke, or I should have mentioned to him that you were likely to come." "I should like to get off as soon as possible," Tom Pearson said, "for by the time that I get back to Ramgur, the rest of the cattle will be in readiness for me." "I will write you an order for 4 large boats at once. If you had come 3 weeks sooner, you might have been kept waiting some days; but such a number of native craft have of late come down the rivers that we are unable to get sufficient for our work." The officer gave him a note to the one in charge of the landing arrangements. "It's lucky that you have come just at this moment," the latter said. "We have just made our last trip with the baggage of the 47th, and I have 6 boats disengaged. You may well take them all." The craft in question were some of those that had been captured, unwieldy craft that took fish and salt up the river. They were almost as large as the dhows in which the cattle had been brought down, but drew very much less water. They were towed off to the dhows, one, by 2 captured war canoes, each having 30 rowers. One was taken to each dhow, and the work of transshipping the cattle began at once. These were in good condition, for although closely packed, they had been well supplied with food and water on the way down, and a herdsman with 4 men under him had been sent in each boat to take care of them, as Tom Pearson was very anxious that his first consignment should be reported upon favourably. The animals were all landed in the course of the afternoon, and with the acknowledgment of their receipt in excellent order in his pocket, the contractor went off again with Stanley to his own dhow. "I have told them to have everything in readiness to drop down the river with the tide tomorrow morning. It will turn just about sunrise. That is a rare bit of business, Stanley, and I doubt if a contractor ever got his work through so quickly before. Of course, it is principally due to you. They would never have pushed things through so quickly, had you not gone with me. I thought that very likely I might be detained here a week before I could get all the cattle on shore, and by that time, if all goes well, I shall be at Ramgur again. Now we can have a comfortable evening's talk, which is very much better than my going to dine with you at the mess, for there is a great deal to hear about, and I dare say that I can give you as good a dinner as we should have had on shore." "A good deal better," Stanley said. "Things have improved immeasurably during the last month. Still, our mess cook is certainly not so good as your man, and at any rate, the quiet of your cabin makes a very pleasant change, after always sitting down with a large party." After dinner was over, Stanley gave a full account of his adventures from the time that he was taken prisoner. "You have done wonderfully well for yourself, lad, wonderfully well. Certainly, when you picked up Burmese from my man, we had no idea that it was ever likely to turn out so useful. I thought that it would have been an assistance among the Mugs on the coast, and I had, too, some idea that the war might lead to the opening of a trade up the Irrawaddy, but it has turned out infinitely more useful than that. If you could not have spoken Burmese, Bandoola would never have thought of asking for you to be spared as an interpreter, and if he had not done so, you would have had your head chopped off at Ava. Of course, that leopard business was the turning point of your fortunes, but though it has turned out so well, I must say that I hardly think that you were justified in risking your life in such a desperate act for a native, who might, for aught you know, be already dead. Of course, it was a most gallant action, but the betting was 10 to 1 against your succeeding. However, as it turned out, it was a fortunate business altogether. I don't say that you might not have made your way down to Rangoon unaided, but the odds would have been very heavily against it. However, these rubies were a windfall indeed." "Will you take the rest of them, uncle, and sell them at Calcutta, or shall I send them to Madras, or home to England?" "I will take them with me to Calcutta, if you like, Stanley. I don't say that there are better men there than the one you sent them to in Madras, but I think some of them do a larger business up country with the native princes, who don't care what they give for good gems. At any rate, I will take them there and get them valued by an expert, and then try 2 or 3 of the leading firms and get their offers. If these are as high as the value put on them by the expert, I would send them to England through my agents, who would do the best they could for you. For us, uncle, of course, it is all in the partnership business. You've just got some contracts that will pay well, and while you've been doing that, I've been getting hold of these rubies." "Oh, I don't think that's fair, Stanley," his uncle said gravely. "It seems to me perfectly fair, and besides, the money put into the business will make a lot of difference, and will certainly pay me a great deal better than it would in any other way. I sent home £100 for my mother, directly the money came from Calcutta, and told her that I hoped to be able to send home at least as much every year." "A good deal more, lad, if you like. I calculate these contracts that have got, so far, will bring in £1 a head, so that by the time that the war is over, I hope to have cleared £8,000, which will be about what you will make by your rubies, and then the trade begins again. We shall be in a position to do it on a big scale, but I still think that it will not be fair to take that money." "Well, uncle, if you won't take it, I certainly won't have anything to do with the money that you make while I am away, so please don't let us say anything more about it. Shall I give you that 1,800 now, or will you have an order upon the paymaster in Calcutta?" "That would be the best way, if you will have it so, lad. I have left money with Johnson at Ramgur for the next herd that is to come down here, and have orders from my agent on their agents at Dalla for those that I am going to buy for the Manipur column. So I don't want the money now, and I suppose the dhow were to be lost going up, the cash might go with it. So do you get the order. You'd better send it straight to Bothron, and tell him to collect it and credit it to my account. How long do you think that this business is going to last?" "Oh, it depends on how far we have to go before the Burmese decide that they have had enough of it. At present, the general hope is that as soon as we arrive at Prome, they'll give in. If they don't, we may have to go up to Ava, and in that case we may not finish it until this time next year, for I suppose operations will have to come to a stop when the wet season begins again, and we could hardly reach Ava before that." "I expect some day we shall have to take the whole country, Stanley. You may frighten the court into submission when you approach the capital, but I fancy they will never keep to the terms that we shall insist upon, and that there will have to be another expedition. That seems to be generally our way. It was so at Mysore. It's been so in a dozen other places. When we've done all the work, and have gotten them at our mercy, we give them comparatively easy terms. As soon as they recover from the effects of their defeat, they set to work again to prepare for another tussle, and then we have all the expense and loss of life to incur again, and then end by annexing their territory, which we might just as well have done in the first place. It may be all very well to be lenient when one is dealing with a European enemy, but magnanimity does not pay when you have to do with Orientals, who don't care a rap for treaty engagements, and who always regard concessions as being simply a proof of weakness. There would not be half the difficulty in annexing Burma that there would be in the case of a large province in India, for all the towns and most even of their villages lie on rivers, and a couple of dozen gunboats would suffice to keep the whole country in order. You will see that that is what we shall have to do some day, but it will cost us 2 or 3 expeditions to do what might just as well have been done now." "Well, uncle, it's nearly 12 o'clock, and as I shall be on duty at 6, I think I had better be going. I wish that you could have stayed for another 2 or 3 days, and paid a visit to the pagoda and the camps. I am very glad that I have had a sight of you again, though it's a very short one." "Oh, I should be glad to stay another day or two, Stanley, but it really is important for me to get down to Ramgur as soon as I can, and send Johnson off with the cattle, for I want to set about buying the herds for the other column as quickly as possible. I think I have left myself a fair margin of time, but there is nothing like promptitude in delivery, and I want to get a good name for future business. And if this affair here is going to last another 12 months, regular supplies must be sent up, for as beef is forbidden by the Burmese religion, they keep no cattle except for draft purposes, and the army must get their bullocks by sea." 5 minutes later Stanley was rowed ashore. The next morning he accompanied the general, and went down to inspect the newly arrived cattle. "They are a capital lot," the general said to Stanley. "Decidedly the best that we have had yet. You see, it's a good deal shorter voyage from Ramgur than from either Calcutta or Madras, and the animals probably had a much shorter land journey before they were shipped. Then, too, as your uncle came down himself, they were no doubt much better looked after than usual on the voyage. However, I will take care to mention, when I write next to Calcutta, that the cattle are far above the average, and I shall be glad if they will arrange for such further supplies as we may require, from the same source." "Thank you, sir. That will be a great help to my uncle. Hitherto he has had very uphill work of it, though he was beginning to get on very well when the war put a stop to trade. He knows the whole country so thoroughly that he can certainly buy up cattle at many places where no European trader save himself has ever penetrated." "No doubt, Brooke, and I hope for your sake that he will succeed well in this contracting business. He has certainly made an excellent start, and as he is first in the field in the country between Assam and Rangoor, he ought to make a good thing of this opportunity that has fallen in his way. I know that it takes a long time to build up a business, but when the foundation is laid, and a man is quick in taking advantage of an opportunity, he can do as much in a year as he might do in 20 without it. Now, I am going over to the lines of the 47th to see how they have shaken down into them." The regiment had brought out tents, for as every building was already occupied, it was necessary that they should be put under canvas. The general found that everything was arranged in order, and the encampment certainly presented a pleasing contrast to the irregular and often crowded quarters of the troops who had passed the wet season there. The colonel and 3 of his officers dined with the general that evening, the party being made up of the military staff, including the 2 aides de camp. 2 days later Stanley, with some of the other members of the staff, dined at the 47th mess. Stanley was introduced to several of the officers, and these were specially desirous of making his acquaintance, as they had learned that he had been a prisoner at Ava, and could therefore tell them much more than they had hitherto learned of the country into which they were about to advance. Among them was a young lieutenant, also of the name of Brooke. Stanley had 3 weeks before attained the same rank. At the time that he was appointed to the 83rd, there were already several death vacancies in the regiment, and disease and fighting had carried off 6 more officers. The whole of the ensigns had consequently obtained their step. At dinner he found himself placed next to his namesake. "It is curious, our having the same name," the other remarked as he sat down. "It is not a very common one." "No, I have not met anyone of the same name before. Indeed, until the affairs at Ramoo, I was nearly 3 years trading with an uncle of mine up the rivers, and was not much in the way of falling in with white men. But before that I had been with my father in a good many stations in India, but I do not, as far as I can remember, recollect meeting anyone of the same name." "Then your father was in the service, too?" "Yes, he was a captain in the 15th Native Infantry." "Indeed," the other said in surprise. "Then we are connections, but I had no idea that Captain Brooke was ever married." "He was married just after he came out to India," Stanley said, "so it is likely enough that you would never have heard of it. He died 3 years ago, and my mother and sisters are now in England. What is the connection between us? I have never heard my father speak much of his family." "Your father was a cousin of mine, second cousin, I think. I fancy there was some row between your grandfather and the rest of the family. I don't know anything about the rights or wrongs of it, for it was, of course, many years before we were born, and I never heard of your father's existence until a fortnight before I left England. Then there were some inquiries made about the family, owing to various deaths that took place in it. Do you know that your father was related, distantly of course, to the Earl of Netherly?" "Yes, I do remember his mentioning it once. I know he said that it was a distant connection, and that he knew nothing whatever about the earl of his family." "Well, curiously enough, it is not so distant now," the other said. "I was a pretty distant connection of his. He was childless, and the family generally didn't seem to have been prolific. A good many of them died, and the result was, the year before I left England, an uncle of mine succeeded to the title. He has no son, and my father was his next brother. My father died 2 years ago, and the result is, to my astonishment, I found that I was next heir to the title. They wanted me to leave the army when my regiment was ordered out to India, but of course I was not going to do that, for my aunt may die and my uncle marry again and have children. Besides, I was not going to leave anyhow, just as the regiment was ordered abroad and might see service. However, there was a great hunting by the lawyers in the genealogical tree, and I know it was decided that in case anything happened to me, your father would have been the next heir, had he been alive. I don't know whether any further inquiries were made, or whether they ever ascertained that he had married. I don't suppose there were, for, of course, as long as I lived the matter is of no importance. So that, as things stand now, if a Burmese bullet puts an end to my career, you are the next heir to the title." "Well, you surprise me indeed," Stanley said. "From the way my father spoke of the matter, I am sure that he had not the slightest idea there was any likelihood whatever that he would have had any chance of succeeding to the title." "That I can well imagine, for it was not until a few years ago, when the deaths of several who stood between him and the succession occurred, that my uncle regarded his coming into it as a matter worth thinking about, and of course all our family stood between it and your father. However, as you see, we have dwindled away, and if I do not get safely through this business, you are the next heir." "It is certainly curious news to hear at a dinner in Burma," Stanley said thoughtfully. "At any rate, I can assure you honestly that the news gives me no particular satisfaction. I suppose it would be a nice thing to come in for a peerage, but my prospects out here are good. I have no intention of staying in the army after the end of the war, and am really in partnership with my uncle, with whom I have been for the last 3 years in business, which is turning out very well. I like the life, and have every chance of making enough to retire on with ample means. Certainly I should not like to come into the title by the death of anyone that I knew." "Well, that is the fortune of war," the other said, smiling. "We get our steps by death vacancies. We're sorry for the deaths, but the steps are not unwelcome. Oh, by the way, my name is Harry. I know that yours is Stanley. I vote that we call each other by them. We are cousins, you know, and I suppose that as you are my heir, you must be my nearest male relative at present. So I vote that we call each other by our Christian names, instead of brooking each other always." "Oh, I shall be very glad to do so," Stanley said cordially. "I hope that we shall be close friends as well as distant relations." Then, as there was a momentary lull in the conversation, Harry raised his voice and said to the colonel: "A very curious thing has just happened, Colonel. Brooke and myself have just discovered that we are cousins, and what is still more curious, that if anything happens to me, he takes my place as next heir to my uncle, a fact of which he was entirely ignorant." "Well, that is certainly a very curious coincidence, Brooke. Very singular. Then you have not met before?" "I did not even know of his existence, Colonel, and had indeed no idea that Captain Brooke, his father, had been married. The cousinship's a distant one, but there is no question, whatever, as to his being next in succession to myself to the peerage." The discovery excited general interest, and quite turned the conversation, for the time, from the subject of the war and of their approaching advance. After dinner was finished, many of the officers gathered round Stanley, asking him questions about the nature of the country, and his experiences as a captive in the hands of the Burmese. Presently Colonel Adair, who had also dined at the mess, joined the group. "I suppose, Mr. Brooke," he said, "your newly found cousin had told you about his adventure with the leopard?" "Why, no, Colonel, he has not said anything about a leopard." "He is grievously afflicted with modesty," the colonel went on, "and so I tell it for him, for I think you ought to know that he is not only able to speak half a dozen languages, but that he is capable of doing deeds of exceptional gallantry. You can go and chat with the colonel, Brooke. He is anxious to hear your report as to the country, and I will be your trumpeter here." Stanley gladly moved away, and entered into conversation with the colonel of the 47th, while Colonel Adair related his adventures with the leopard to his cousin and the officers standing round. "By Jove, that was a plucky thing," Harry Brooke said admiringly. "It was indeed," the colonel agreed, as similar exclamations went round the circle. "I don't think one man in 100 would have attacked a leopard with no weapon but a knife, except to save the life of a comrade. Even then it would be a most desperate action. I've done a good deal of big game hunting in India, but I am certain that nothing but a strong affection for a comrade in the grasp of a leopard would induce me to risk almost certain death in the way your cousin did. We should never have heard of it, if we had not got the details from the man he saved, and who has since attached himself to him as a servant, and is the man who, as I dare say he did tell you, served as his companion and guide in making his way down here. At any rate, you see, Brooke, your cousin is an uncommonly fine young fellow, and you have reason to be proud of the relationship." "Oh, I feel so, Colonel, and it is really a pleasure to know that, if one does go down, a thoroughly good fellow will benefit by it, instead of some unknown person who might be a very objectionable representative of the family." For the next 3 or 4 days the bustle of preparations went on, and on the 5th a detachment was sent up, with a sloop and gunboats, to attack an advanced position of the enemy on the Line River. Although the 3,000 Burmese, who were posted in a strong stockade, were supported by 36 guns, the works were carried by storm with little loss. The 2 branches of the Palang or Rangoon River, by which the forces were to advance against Donabew, were on the following day reconnoitred for some distance. A number of fire rafts were destroyed, but the Burmese were too disheartened to offer any resistance. To the disappointment of the troops, the general was able to take with him only a limited force, for the difficulties of carriage were enormous, and as experience had shown that the country was likely to be deserted and devastated on their approach, it was therefore impossible for the bulk of the army to be taken on by land. There were other points, however, where the troops left behind could be profitably employed. The capture of the important town of Bassein, on the main branch of the Irrawaddy, would open the river to the passage of our ships, and put an entire stop to the trade of Ava. The force told off for the advance against Donabew was divided into two columns. The first, 2,400 strong, consisting of the 38th, 41st, and 47th regiments, 3 native battalions, the troop of bodyguard, a battery of Bengal horse artillery, and part of the rocket company, was to march by land. The second column, which was to proceed by water, was 1,169 strong, and it consisted of the 89th Regiment, the 10th Madras Europeans, and 250 of the 18th Native Infantry, a body of dismounted artillery, and the rest of the rocket company. This force was commanded by Brigadier General Cotton. It was to be carried in a flotilla of 62 boats, each armed with 1 or 2 guns, and the boats of all the ships of war at Rangoon, under the command of Captain Alexander, R.N. Major Sale was at the same time to advance against Bassein, with 600 men of the 13th Regiment and the 12th Madras Native Infantry, with some artillery. After occupying the town, he was to cross the country, lying between the two main arms of the Irrawaddy, and to join the general's force near Donabew. The rest of the force, nearly 4,000 men, chiefly native regiments and Europeans who had not, as yet, recovered sufficient strength to take part in field operations, was to remain at Rangoon, under Brigadier General McCrae, who was to form a reserve column in readiness to move as directed, as soon as sufficient transport was collected. It was to the water force that the capture of Donabew was entrusted, as it lay upon the opposite bank of the Irrawaddy, while the general's force was directed against Tharawa, at the junction of the two main branches of the river. Here they were to be joined by General Cotton's force after the capture of Donabew. Then, unless the court of Ava sued for peace, a united advance was to be made on the important town of Prome. Chapter 11. Donabew. Stanley Brooke did not accompany the land column, as the general said to him 2 days before. "I have been speaking with General Cotton, and he said that he should be glad if I would attach you to his staff, at least until the forces unite again. Not one of his staff officers speaks Burmese, and although he has 2 or 3 interpreters with him, it will be better, if Bandoola sends in an officer offering to surrender, that he should be met by a British officer. In the next place, it may be necessary for him to communicate with me, and assuredly, with your experience of the country, you would be able to get through better than anyone else. I do not apprehend that there would be any great danger, for we know that every available fighting man has been impressed by Bandoola, and the passage of our column will completely cow the villagers lying between us and the river. I suppose," he said with a smile, "that you have no objection, since it will save you a long and, I have no doubt, a very unpleasant march, and you will also obtain a view of the affairs at the stockades at Pelang and Donabew." The land column started on the 13th of February, the water column on the 16th, and the detachment for Bassein sailed on the following day. Stanley was delighted at being appointed to accompany the boat column. The march through the country would present no novelty to him, and it was probable that the land column would encounter no serious resistance until, after being joined by General Cotton's force, it advanced against Prome. His horses went, with those of General Cotton and his staff, under charge of the Sais and Meinik. The one steamboat kept, at the start, in the rear of the great flotilla of boats, so that in case of any of them striking on a sandbank, it could at once move to her assistance and pull her off. The scene was a very bright one, as in all upwards of 100 craft of various sizes proceeded together. In front were half a dozen gunboats. Next to these came the 2 sloops of war, followed by the rest of the boats, proceeding in irregular order. There was very little stream, for the rivers were now quite low, and although the flat country was still little more than a swamp, the rains in the hills that supplied the main body of water to them had long since ceased. The ship's boats were, of course, rowed by the bluejackets. The other craft were, for the most part, manned by natives, though the soldiers on board occasionally lent a hand. 2 days after starting, the boats destroyed 3 newly erected stockades that were found unoccupied, and on the 19th reached Pelang, where 3 very strong stockades had been erected. A battery was thrown up next day, from which, as well as from the steamboat and sloops of war, shells were thrown into the stockade, with such effect that 2 of the enemy's works were evacuated as soon as the troops took the offensive, and the main Pelang stockade was also abandoned without resistance. The 2 smaller works were destroyed, and a portion of the 18th Madras Infantry was left here to maintain communication with Rangoon. On the 27th the flotilla entered the main stream, and the next day the advance came in sight of Donabew. It was another 5 days before the whole force was in position, for several of the most heavily laden craft stuck fast on the sandbanks at the fork of the river. The next day Donabew was summoned to surrender. Bandoola, who was at the head of 15,000 men, returned a refusal, which was given in courteous terms, differing very widely from the haughty and peremptory language in which all previous communications had been couched. The next day a party of the 89th landed on the low-lying ground between the main stockade and the river, and in spite of the heavy fire succeeded in ascertaining the strength and nature of the defences. The main work was in the form of a parallelogram about a mile long, and stood on ground rising above the general level, and 50 pieces of cannon of various sizes were in position on the river face. 2 outworks, constructed of square beams of timber, with an outer ditch and a thick abattis, defended the southern face against an attack from an enemy landing below it. It was necessary to leave a strong guard on board the flotilla, lest an attack should be made by war canoes and fire rafts. The general, therefore, had not more than 600 men available for the assault. As the enemy's guns completely commanded the river, it was necessary to land below it, and on the morning of the 7th the troops were disembarked, with 2 6-pounder guns and a rocket detachment. Forming in 2 columns, they advanced against the lower of the 2 covering stockades, and after an exchange of fire with the enemy, rushed forward and forced an entrance into it. Although the enemy resisted with more resolution than they had for some time shown, 280 prisoners were taken, and the rest of the defenders fled to the second work. 2 more guns and 4 mortars were landed and placed in position, and after the stockades had been shelled for a short time, a storming party under Captain Rose advanced to the assault. So heavy a fire was opened upon them that the little column was brought to a standstill and forced to fall back, with the loss of its commander and of Captain Cannon of the 89th, while most of the seamen with the storming party were either killed or wounded. This want of success against a mere outwork showed General Cotton that, with the small force at his disposal, it would be worse than useless to renew the attack, for were the outwork carried, the loss would be so great that it would be hopeless to think of attacking Bandoola's main position. He therefore determined to abstain from further attack until reinforced. "Now, Mr. Brooke," he said, as soon as the troops had been taken on board the boats again, "I must bring your services into requisition. This is just the contingency that we thought might possibly occur. I cannot advance up the river until Donabew is taken, and I cannot attack the place with the force at my command. Therefore I will at once write a despatch to General Campbell for you to carry. You will be accompanied by the 2 men of the bodyguard, who have come with me as orderlies. I shall have no use for them here, and the 3 of you together need not fear any molestation from the few people remaining in their villages, and may be able to cut your way through any of the bands of deserters or beaten troops dispersed over the country." "Very well, General. I shall also take my Burman on my second charger. He may be useful in getting news as to the roads from the natives, who will as likely as not fly into the jungle when they see us approaching. However, there is no such fear of our losing our way, as it will be along the river at least as far as Tharawa." A boat was at once sent off to the craft, carrying the 2 orderlies and the horses of the staff. As soon as the despatch was written, Stanley, after shaking hands with his companion, was also rowed to the horse barge. This was, at a signal of the general, taken in tow by the steamer, and piloted to the opposite bank. A boat, sounding ahead, presently found a spot where there was enough water for the barge to get alongside the bank. The horses were led ashore, and Stanley, the 2 troopers, and Meinik mounted. The Burmese are poor riders, but during the wet season Stanley had often taken Meinik on his spare horse when riding about in the camp, partly because he could trust him to look after the horses carefully, and in the second place to accustom him to riding on horseback, so as to act, if required, as an orderly. Meinik was quite of opinion that there would be no risk whatever in passing through villages, but thought it probable that they might fall in with disbanded troops, as it was known that the land column had, soon after starting, captured the fort of Mofi, and that its garrison, between 2,000 and 3,000 strong, had taken to the jungle and dispersed. "Still, master," he said, "I don't think it likely that they will attack us. They will be expecting no one, and we shall come upon them by surprise. Then they will run into the bushes, thinking that you must have many more troops behind you. No, it is not likely that they will have many guns. They would have thrown them away when they fled, partly to run faster through the forest, partly because most of them will be making off to the villages, hoping to lie concealed until the war is over; while if they had guns in their hands, it would be known that they were deserters, and they might be seized and sent across the river to Bandoola, or up to Prome." They rode some 15 miles before dark, and then took up their quarters in a village. The few old men, women, and children inhabiting it fled at their approach, but when Meinik went to the edge of the jungle and shouted out loudly that they need not fear, for that no harm would be done to any of them, and good prices would be given for food, 2 or 3 returned, and finding the statements to be true, one of them went into the jungle again and brought the others back. Fowls and eggs were brought into the hut that Stanley occupied, and a good supply of grain for the horses was also purchased. Thus Stanley was able to avoid breaking into the small stock of provisions that they had brought with them. The inhabitants of this part of Burma were a tribe known as Carians. They were the tillers of the soil, and were an industrious and hardy race. The country was so rich that they not only raised sufficient for their own wants, but sent large supplies of grain and rice to Ava. They were very heavily taxed, but as a rule were exempt from conscription. Nevertheless, they had on the present occasion been forced to labour at the stockades, and in transporting food for the troops. Their forest villages were small. They consisted of little huts erected either in trees shorn of their branches, or upon very strong poles. These abodes were only accessible by rough ladders, formed by nailing pieces of wood across the trees or poles. This was absolutely necessary on account of the number of tigers that infested the forest. The village where they had halted was, however, built upon the ground. It was surrounded by a strong stockade. The people assured Stanley that none of the fugitives from Mofi had come that way. There had, they said, been many after Bandoola's defeat, but they had seen none of late. They declared that they had far greater fear of these than they had of the English, for that they plundered wherever they went, and if they could not obtain enough to satisfy their expectations, burnt the houses, and often killed many of the inhabitants. The villagers volunteered to keep watch all night at the gate of the stockade, although they said there was no fear of anyone approaching, as strangers could not find their way through the forest in the dark, and even could they do so, the fear of tigers would prevent them from making an attempt. Stanley agreed to pay some of them to watch, but also stationed one of his own men as sentry, relieving him every 3 hours. An hour after they reached the village, they saw one of the war boats rowing rapidly up the stream, and had no doubt that it was bearing a message from Bandoola, saying that he had repulsed the attack of the British. Beyond hearing the howling of tigers in the forest, Stanley passed the night undisturbed, except when he went to change the sentry. Meinik took his share of watching, and Stanley himself relieved him an hour before daybreak. By the time the sun rose, the horses had been fed and breakfast taken. After riding some miles, the country became more open. Cultivated fields succeeded the dense forest. The ground was higher, and little groups of huts could be seen, wherever a small elevation rose above the general level. The change was very welcome, for they were able to travel faster, and there was less chance of their coming suddenly upon a party of the disbanded troops. Presently, just as they reached a larger village than usual, by the river bank, a thick smoke arose from one of the houses, and they could hear female screams. "Come on!" Stanley shouted to the 3 men riding behind him. "See that your pistols are ready to hand, and draw your swords." The village was not, like the last, stockaded, being some miles away from the forest. As they dashed into it, they saw some 20 Burmese. 2 women lay dead in front of one house, and one of the men, with a torch, was about to fire another. Absorbed in their own doings, the Burmese did not notice the coming of the horsemen until the latter were close to them. Then, with a cry of consternation, they turned to fly, but it was too late. Stanley cut down the man who was about to fire the hut, and he and the others then fell upon the Burmans with sword and pistol. 6 of them were killed. The rest were pursued, but dashing down to the river they plunged in, pistol shots being sent after them. Stanley remained on the bank until he saw that they had fairly started to cross the river. Then he re-entered the village. 2 or 3 frightened people came out from their hiding places when Meinik shouted to them that all was safe. "They have all gone," he said. "You need not fear being disturbed by them again. See, there are 6 guns lying in the road, and you will find plenty of ammunition on these fellows that have fallen. There are some spears and swords, too. Of course, you can do nothing if a number of these fellows come, but if there are only 2 or 3, you and the women ought to be able to dispose of them." Now we must ride on." On the third day they arrived at Tharawa, and found that Sir Archibald Campbell, who had been assured by the natives that Bandoola had retreated, had continued his march the day before. The place was so large that Stanley thought it unsafe for them to sleep there, and they rode on to a little village 2 miles away. Here they were received with great deference, the passage of the troops the day before having profoundly impressed the villagers. After waiting 3 hours to rest the horses, they again mounted and, riding all night, arrived in the morning at Yuhadid, a village 26 miles from Tharawa, and found the force on the point of starting. "No bad news, I hope, Mr. Brooke?" the general said, as he rode up to him. "I am sorry to say, sir, that my news is not good. Here is the brigadier's despatch." "This is unfortunate, indeed," the general said, when he had run his eye over the document. "Mr. Tollemache, please to ride along the line, and say that the column is not to get in motion until further orders." Colonel Adair and the other officers of the staff had been on the point of mounting when Stanley rode up. The general called 3 or 4 of the senior officers to him. "Cotton can neither take Donabew nor get past it. Here is his despatch. You see he has lost several officers and a good many men, and that in the assault on an outlying work only. I am afraid there is nothing for us to do but go back to his assistance." "I am afraid not, sir," Colonel Adair said. "Our supplies are running short already, and you see we decided upon filling up all the carts at Tharawa, where we made sure that we should be met by the boats. The country round here has been completely stripped, and it would be a very serious matter to endeavour to advance to Prome without supplies. Moreover, we might not expect a much more serious resistance than we have bargained for. The news that Bandoola has repulsed his assailants, and you may be sure that this has been exaggerated into a great victory, will restore the spirit of the Burmese. It is evident that we must turn back and finish off with Bandoola before we advance further." Orders were accordingly sent to the officers commanding the various corps that the column was to retrace its steps, and while they passed through the village, Stanley related in much greater detail than had been given in the despatch the events of the attack and the nature of the defences at Donabew. The troops marched along with a cheerful mien. It was, of course, an annoyance to have to plod back along the road they had just before traversed, but upon the other hand there was a general satisfaction that they were, after all, to take part in the capture of Bandoola's last stronghold. Colonel Adair rode on with the little troop of cavalry. He was to push forward to Tharawa, and was to offer rewards to the natives there for every boat brought in. There was little doubt that many of the fishermen had hauled up their craft into clumps of bushes and brushwood, to prevent their being requisitioned by Bandoola, and although it was not likely that a large number would now be obtained, yet even if but a dozen were found it would be of assistance. The rest of the force reached Tharawa on the following evening, with the exception of a party left to protect the slow moving wagons. They found that 9 canoes had been obtained, and that a considerable portion of the scanty population had been, all day, employed in cutting bamboos and timber for rafts. The next morning the troops were all engaged on the same work, and in the construction of rafts, and at nightfall 300 men of the 49th were taken across the river to the town of Henzada, in case Bandoola, on hearing of the preparations for crossing, should send a force to oppose the passage. It took 4 days' continuous labour to get the little army across, as it was necessary to make large timber rafts to carry the carts, horses and bullocks, guns, and stores. Hearing that a force was posted some 15 miles away to intercept the detachment that was marching from Bassein, Colonel Godwin, with a party, was sent off that night to endeavour to surprise it. The Burmese, however, took the alarm before they were attacked, and scattered in all directions without firing a shot. The army marched along the right bank, and arrived before Donabew on the 25th of March. Communications were opened with General Cotton's force below the town, and both divisions set to work to erect batteries. The Burmese made several sorties to interrupt the work, and one of these was accompanied by Bandoola's 17 elephants. The troop of cavalry, horse artillery, and the rocket company charged close up to the elephants, and opened fire upon the howdahs, filled with troops, that they carried. In a short time most of these and the drivers were killed, and the elephants, many of which also received wounds, dashed off into the jungle, while the infantry fled back into the stockade, into which a discharge of shells and rockets was maintained all day. The next morning, the 1st of April, the mortar batteries were completed, and these and others armed with light guns kept up a continuous fire into the enemy's camp. At daybreak on the 2nd, the heavy guns of the breaching batteries also opened fire, and in a very short time the enemy were seen pouring out in the rear of their works, and making their way into the jungle. As there had been no idea that they would so speedily evacuate the stockade, no preparations had been made for cutting them off, and the garrison therefore effected their escape with but little loss. The troops at once occupied the work, and found large stores of grain and ammunition there, as well as a great number of guns. From some of the wounded Burmans it was ascertained that the evacuation of the fort was due to the death of Bandoola, who had been killed by the explosion of a shell while watching the operations from a lookout that had been erected for him at the top of a lofty tree. His death had caused the most profound depression among the garrison. Their leaders in vain endeavoured to reanimate their courage. The opening of the fire with the heavy guns completed their discomfiture, and they fled without thought of resistance. Indeed, the greater part had been stolen away during the night. A portion of the fleet had already passed up beyond the fort under a heavy fire, and the rest now came up. The supplies of grain were renewed, and a guard being left to hold the works, which would now serve as a base, the army again started up the river. The water column proceeding to Tharawa, the land force marching back to Henzada, whence they were carried across the river in the boats. Here the force was joined by the reserve column from Rangoon, consisting of several companies of the Royals and the 28th Native Infantry, with a supply of elephants and carriage cattle which had arrived from Calcutta. On the 14th, Uadet was again reached. No opposition whatever was encountered. Indeed, the whole country was deserted, the inhabitants having been ordered away by the Burmese authority as soon as the fall of Donabew was known. When within 4 days' march of Prome, 2 native officials came in with a communication to the effect that the Burmese were now ready to treat for peace. As it was known, however, that the reinforcements were on their way down from Ava, it was evident that this was merely a pretext to gain time, and the general sent word that when he arrived at Prome he would be ready to open negotiations for peace. The country through which the army was now passing was very beautiful. In the far distance on the left the mountains of Arakan could be seen, while on the right the country was undulating, richly cultivated, and broken by clumps of timber, with a background of the range of hills running along the Pegu River. On the 24th the heights of Prome, 8 miles away, were visible, and the flotilla could be seen lying at anchor a short distance below the town. Messengers came out that afternoon to endeavour to induce the general not to enter it, but a reply was sent that this was out of the question, that no harm would befall the inhabitants, and that, as soon as he entered, the general would be ready to receive any persons qualified to treat for peace. Some hours before daybreak the army marched forward, and by sunrise were close to the town. The position was found to be extremely strong. Every hill commanding the place had been fortified to the very summit. Strong stockades ran in every direction, and it was evident that a great number of men must have been engaged for a long time in attempting to render the place impregnable. Not a soldier, however, was to be found. A native of the place presently met them with the news that the governor and the troops had evacuated it, with the exception of a small party who were firing the town. This story was corroborated by wreaths of smoke rising at various points. The troops pressed forward at the top of their speed. On entering the town, they found that the native population had all been forced to leave, and, piling their arms, they set to work to extinguish the flames, which they did not, however, succeed in doing until nearly half the town was destroyed. Fortunately, the fire was checked before it reached the great magazines of grain and other stores for the army. The belief that the negotiations had been only pretext to arrest the advance of the troops against the town, until the expected reinforcements arrived, was confirmed by the natives, who presently came in from hiding places where they had taken refuge, until their army retired. They said that, as soon as the news came of the fall of Donabew, fresh levies were ordered to be collected in every part of Upper Burma, while the whole population of the province had been employed in adding to the defences of the town, which had been already very strongly stockaded. It was a disappointment to the force, which had hoped that the occupation of Prome would bring about the submission of the court of Ava, and enable them to be taken down the river in boats and embark before the rainy season set in again. Nevertheless, the prospect of passing that season at Prome was vastly more pleasant than it had been to spend the season at Rangoon. They were now inland, beyond the point where the rains were continuous. The town was situated on high ground, and the country round was open and healthy, although for some distance round the cattle had been driven off and the villages destroyed. It was certain that flying columns would be able to bring in any amount of cattle before the wet season began. For a short time it was thought that the occupation of Prome would show the king and the court that it was useless to continue the struggle any longer, But these hopes were dissipated when it was known that a further levy of 30,000 men had been called out. The court, however, was apparently conscious that its commands would no longer be obeyed with the alacrity before manifested. The early levies had obeyed the call with cheerfulness, believing in their invincibility, and confident that they would return home laden with spoil, after driving without difficulty the audacious strangers into the sea. Things, however, had not turned out so. The troops that had left Ava in high spirits had been routed with very heavy losses. Their great general, Bandoola, had been killed, and fugitives from the army were scattered over the land, bearing with them reports of the extraordinary fighting powers of these white enemies, and of the hopelessness of attempting to resist them. The consequence was that, in issuing the order for the new levy, a bounty of £20, which to the Burmans was a very large sum, was offered to each man who obeyed the call. The first step on the part of the British general was to send proclamations throughout the country, guaranteeing protection to all, and inviting the population to return to their towns and villages. The troops were employed in erecting, with the assistance of as much native labour as could be procured, comfortable huts outside the town, so that the natives, on returning, should find their homes unoccupied and untouched. It was not long before this excellent policy had its due effect. As soon as those who first returned sent the news to their friends, the fugitives came out from their hiding places in the forests in great numbers, and returned to the city. Those whose homes were still standing settled down in them, and resumed their ordinary avocations, just as if their native rulers were still in authority; while those whose houses had been burned set to work, with a cheerfulness characteristic of their race, to re-erect their light wooden dwellings. So favourable were the reports spread through the country of our conduct that, in a short time, the population of Prome was considerably larger than it had been before the advance of our army. Similar results were speedily manifest throughout the whole district below the town. From the great forest that covered more than half of it, the villagers poured out, driving before them herds of cattle, and in 2 or 3 months the country that had appeared a desert became filled with an industrious population. Order was established, the local civil officers were again appointed to their former posts, but their powers of oppression and intimidation were abrogated by the order that no punishment beyond a short term of imprisonment was to be inflicted on any person whatever, until the case had been brought before the British authorities. And soon the only fear entertained by the people of the rich district of the lower Irrawaddy was that the British troops would march away, and leave them again to the oppression and tyranny of their former masters. The markets of Prome were abundantly supplied with food of all sorts, and as everything was liberally paid for, any number of bullocks were obtainable; for although the Burmese are forbidden by their religion to kill cattle, and therefore keep them only for draught purposes, they had no objection to our killing them, or indeed to eat the meat when they could obtain it. Labour of all kinds was abundant, and great numbers of canoes were constructed, for the purpose of bringing up supplies from the villages on the river, and for the advance of the force at the end of the wet season. Until this set in earnest, small bodies of troops marched through the forests, driving out the bands that infested them, and plundered and killed the country people without mercy. The general's aides de camp had a busy time of it, being constantly employed in carrying orders to the towns and villages, in hearing complaints, and, in Stanley's case, entering into agreements for the purchase of cattle and grain. When in Prome, he spent a good deal of his spare time with his cousin, who, having bought a horse, frequently obtained leave to accompany him on his excursions on duty. A warm friendship had sprung up between them. Harry was 2 years older than Stanley, and had been at Eton up to the time that he entered the army. He was, however, in a manner no older than his cousin, whose work for the 3 years previous to the outbreak of war had rendered him graver and more manly than a life spent among lads of his own age could have done. Meinik always accompanied Stanley wherever he went. He had now, to the latter's quiet amusement, modified his Burmese costume, making it look like that of some of the whites, and indeed he would have passed without notice as one of the Goa Portuguese mess waiters, in his suit of white nankeen. When riding, or on any service away from the headquarter camp, he was dressed in a suit of rough brown khaki, which he had obtained from one of the traders at Rangoon. The coat differed but little from that of the suit Stanley had handed over to him, except that it was somewhat shorter and without the small shoulder cape, and in fact resembled closely the modern regimental tunic. Below he wore knee breeches of the same material, with puttees or long bands of cloth wound round and round the leg, and which possessed many advantages over gaiters. He still clung to the turban, but instead of being white it was of the same colour as his clothes, and was much larger than the Burmese turban. "Burmese are great fools," he often said to Stanley. "They think they know a great deal. They know nothing at all. They think they are great fighters. They are no good at fighting, for one Englishman beats 10 of them. Their government is no good. It keeps everyone very poor and miserable. You come here, you know nothing of the country, and yet you make everyone comfortable. We ride through the villages. We see everyone rejoicing that they are governed by the English, and hope that the English will never go away again. What do you think, sir? Will you stay here always? You have had much trouble to take the country. A great many people have been ill. A great many died. Now you have got it. Why should you go away again?" "It is quite certain that we shall not give it all up, Meinik. It has been, as you say, a troublesome and very expensive business, and the farther the king obliges us to go up before he makes peace, the more he will have to pay, either in money or territory. Of course, I cannot say what the terms of peace will be, but I should think that, very likely, we shall hold the country from the sea up to here, with Aracan and a strip along the sea coast of Tenasserim." "That will be good," Meinik said. "I shall never go outside the English land again. There will be plenty to do, and a great trade on the river. Everyone will be happy and contented. I should be a fool to go back to Upper Burma, where they would chop off my head if they knew that I had been down to Rangoon when the English were there."